Can you still? There we go. Sorry about that. All right, so we're talking about breaking the mold, using cognitive behavioral therapy to address eating disorders. Talking about looking at through a mirror darkly. For many, not being comfortable in their skin is a horror that begins from the moment they open their eyes to when they close them at night. Some do not even find respite then, plagued with nightmares of shame, embarrassment, and cruelty. To cope with this emotional bombardment of inadequacy, personal loathing, and judgment, eating disorders are common choices many turn to for a means of dealing with this constant stress. In this presentation, we will take a detailed look at the complexities of these disorders, some of the stigmas surrounding them, and the difficulties individuals find in seeking treatment. We will also hear a firsthand account of the experiences one person has in treating the disorder. So an unhealthy alliance. According to the National Eating Disorder Association, up to 50% of individuals with eating disorders use alcohol or illicit drugs, a rate 5 times higher than the general population. Up to 35% of individuals who are dependent on alcohol or other drugs have also had eating disorders, a rate 11 times greater than the general population. The substances most frequently used by individuals with eating disorders or with subclinical symptoms include alcohol, laxatives, emetics, diuretics, amphetamines, heroin, and cocaine. Eating disorders and substance use share several common risk factors, including brain chemistry, family history, low self-esteem, depression, anxiety, and social pressures. Other shared characteristics include compulsive disorder, social isolation, and risk for suicide. So details behind drunkorexia. I know this may be a new term for some folks who may not be involved in the peer-to-peer aspect. So I wanted to put this in there because this is a very common term that we see come up in a lot of different demographics that we work with in the peer recovery groups associated with Smart Recovery. Drunkorexia is a colloquial term that refers to altering eating behaviors to either offset for planned caloric intake from alcohol or to increase speed the effects of alcohol. Not a clinical diagnosis and not necessarily indicative of a substance abuse problem. The term is often used in a context for college campuses, but disordered eating and binge drinking is a pattern that can be seen across all demographics. Regardless of whether the behaviors become diagnosable conditions, the relationship between food restriction or purging behaviors and high levels of alcohol use put individuals at risk for significant medical complications in the short and long term. It's important that these dangerous behaviors be identified and treated as soon as possible. Some rule of context, we in our youth meeting that we hold weekly online, many of the young men and women there often share that they will purge before a party so they get drunk faster. They want their stomachs empty of food so that they intake the alcohol and digest it into their systems on a quicker level. So this is actually a very common problem. It's come up many, many times in our national meetings. And it's far-reaching. The damage this disorder in correlation with substance use is far-reaching beyond college campuses, parties, or prom night. Purging can become a common abusive disorder in any number of demographics where proper diet and caloric intake are major factors. Some that are particularly susceptible are active duty military, highly active first responder units, professional combat sports practitioners, models, and professional dancers. I myself can attest to this because as I was in the Army, this was a common practice before scheduled PT tests that were ranked and utilized to help individuals gain rank and stature in their services and units. So this is very, very common among these demographics. It's not to say that this is exclusive to those who rely on physical fitness for their livelihood in any sense. According to a recent study conducted by the British Columbia Children's Hospital, eating disorders are often diagnosed in teenagers and young adults, but many people are first diagnosed with an eating disorder in later adulthood. Sometimes these first signs and symptoms develop at a much younger age. Many changes occur in our bodies during adolescence. These changes can be very difficult for some youth. Sometimes those who are dissatisfied with their bodies will turn to disordered eating. However, there are many risk factors for eating disorders, and not everyone who is unhappy with their body will develop an eating disorder. Some types of eating disorders are more common in women and girls than in men and boys. However, eating disorders affect people of all gender. Transgender, non-binary, and gender diverse youth report higher rates of eating disorder symptoms than cisgender youth, those whose gender aligns with the sex that were assigned to them at birth. Both the National Eating Disorder Association and the Trevor Project state that the following report was based off an online survey of over 1,000 young people. Among the 46% of the LGBTQ youth who were surveyed and had never been diagnosed with an eating disorder, 54% reported that at some point suspected they suffered from an undiagnosed eating disorder. Out of the survey's respondents, 75% said that they either had been diagnosed with an eating disorder or suspected they had at one point developed one in their life. Some all too common roadblocks. Men, boys, and gender diverse individuals may experience more barriers to accessing support for eating disorders and may be less likely to be diagnosed with an eating disorder. It may be hard for people who are experiencing eating disorder symptoms to talk about their behavior. Sometimes people who worry about what others will think about them. Some people may be worried about untrue stereotypes that exist about eating disorders. These fears may make it harder for people to get the help they need. Some people may also be worried about what it would be like to start making changes to their eating. The information we get about eating disorders from television, magazines, or social media is not always true. For example, some people view eating disorders as a choice rather than a serious biological illness. We also get these same type of common factors within substance use disorders. We see that the same type of barriers hinder those who feel they may have a substance use disorder, but are afraid to come forward and ask for help. So some of the typical inhibitors we see with those seeking help for eating disorders, I've broken down in some of the more common internal and external factors. Starting with the internal, the irrational belief that the behavior is normal. These are some things that very closely correlate with what we see in substance use disorders, especially within the pre-contemplative and contemplative stages. Feeling that there is no other way to achieve the goal of self-acceptance. We see a lot of this when individuals have tried other methods and been unsuccessful. They see a quick gain with purging and other unhealthy factors of eating disorders like starving themselves and so on and so forth. So they continue with that action because they are seeing immediate results, not looking at the long-term consequences because of the shame they feel and lack of reliance on their self-esteem and self-worth. A fear of ridicule, judgment, or alienation. Now, this is something that correlates with both internal and external inhibitors, because we also see that as an external inhibitor from peer pressure from friends, family, or loved ones. For instance, body shaming. A lot of times when it's portrayed in social media, it's always correlating with the general public or schools or peers. A lot of body shaming starts at home. Parents and siblings will be the ones that originally correlate the behavior, thus creating this factor in the in the individual's mind that this is what they are. And then it is incorporated once they get into social factors, which then adds on to the problem. Co-occurring mental health disorders. So as I mentioned in my introduction, I have a co-occurring dual diagnosis with clinical depression and alcoholism. Some individuals who suffer from eating disorders also suffer from these, including with substance use disorders. So by battling both ends, sometimes an individual may have an issue balancing what to treat first, and therefore may neglect problematic behavior that can then sabotage their success in other fields that they are trying to reincorporate, to remanage in their lives. And then finally, misinformation from societal sources about the definition of attraction and beauty, the perception of what beautiful is supposed to look like. Striving to get to someone else's idea of what is pretty has caused so much harm, and not only our youth, but in the general public that we see suffering from certain irrational belief systems, maladaptive behaviors, or these mental health and substance use disorders. So where does SMART come in? Like any other addiction disorders and maladaptive behaviors causing harm in a participant's life, SMART recovery can help the individual find out about the why the eating disorder exists and how to successfully eliminate, mitigate, and or balance that factor so it no longer causes harm in the person's lifestyle. It is important to remember that recovery looks different to many different people. We may share a commonality in addiction, but what we seek in our recovery goals and how we get there can be as individualistic as the person, as the people involved in the process. Smart Recovery utilizes CBT and REBT-based tools to help the person find out what that looks like for them specifically, thus emphasizing the program's principal values of self-management and self-empowerment. The open door policy. Smart recovery has no prerequisites for participation or use, therefore, no dogmatic statements of how to participate or what you need to be before joining. We accept any individuals on any stages of change of their recovery, no matter what that they are recovering from. Therefore, it is more appealing to a wider group of those who may be suffering from ailments such as, but not limited to, problematic eating disorders. Spiritually neutral. Life choices, sexual preferences, and gender identification can make it exceptionally difficult for a person to seek treatment for a mental health or addiction disorder. This is due largely to the projection of other people's values onto that individual when addressing their treatment. Smart recovery addresses religion and spirituality as a voluntary choice and not a requirement for recovery. Therefore, there are no preordained boundaries involved when utilizing this program that may be caused by religious or spiritual beliefs. Demographics such as young adults, atheists, and LGBTQ who may have found difficulties in seeking treatment before have found evidence-based practices such as SMART a more accepting method of recovery, which increases their individual chances of success. Structured core. Due to its tangible, practical nature, the SMART recovery program brings a sense of order to the chaotic pattern that revolves around discovery of successful recovery. Rather than leaving things to chance or fate, SMART encourages development of internal locus of control to help individuals take more accountability for their actions, decisions, and consequences. For this reason, groups with military or first responder backgrounds, business, analytical, or logistic professionals, and educational parties also find programs such as SMART beneficial to work their way through their addictive disorders. Breaking down the recovery process into a step-by-step process with multiple options for success is a concept that these demographics can relate to quite well due to their chosen professions and life callings. Medical assisted treatment. Another major principle for SMART recovery that works towards treating eating disorders and other addictive behaviors is its acceptance and support of MAT under the strict approval, guidance, and administration of medical professional or professionals. Not all will find this approach appealing, but others will see great success when combining cognitive reconstructive efforts with medically enhanced treatment. A testimony of truth. As a final disposition to this presentation, please give your attention to a person who has experienced life with this affliction firsthand and how they found SMART recovery to be a gateway towards the recovery they personally desired.
You're listening to the Smart Recovery Podcast. We're talking with Stacy McKeever. She is someone who struggles with food addiction, who is addressing those circumstances through Smart Recovery. And we're going to get into, Stacy, how you found Smart Recovery and what kinds of things you're learning there.
My start with this, I've been on a diet. I was put on a diet when I was 8 years old, and that was diet pills. And it was prescribed by the doctor. My mom was a little hesitant, but she tried because clearly I was gaining weight more than they thought I should be. And it's progressed to being, I use food to cope with feelings, whether they're good feelings, bad feelings, upset, anger, feelings of despondency, feelings of being dropped. It covers the gamut. And so I learned how to do that. And then really it's been, I got into therapy for something completely different. And then it turned out, no, it wasn't. I got in because I was trying to take care of one feeling. And as we started unpeeling and unpacking everything, it came to the bedrock of the fact that I have a food addiction with a side of clutter. And basically it's about my inability to feel space and to take up my space. So instead of doing it verbally and having boundaries verbally, I did it physically. And at one point I was almost as round as I was tall.
Okay.
So that's how it got started. So I found SMART. My therapist suggested it because for a while I had been going to Overeaters Anonymous, and I didn't want to be there, didn't want to be touched, didn't just, it was, the whole, I got to the point where I realized that my issue with food wasn't because there was there wasn't a spiritual hole in my life. Like I knew that. And so it was suggested, and we talked about me going. And so I went, and I go into it always as sort of like a deer caught in headlights, because initially I was so freaked out about even admitting to the fact that I had an addiction. And even sometimes it's still hard for me to like sit with that and to own that part. And so I went in, and I was very quiet. What I found was the fact that it felt less, there wasn't as much, you're a horrible person. If you slip, you have to go back to step one.
Mhm.
There was more of a feeling of, this is what happens in addiction.
So you had been talking about the idea of SMART meetings versus Overeaters Anonymous, and some of the initial things that were different for you and more valuable.
So with Overeaters Anonymous, even though feeling like I was with other people, there still was this feeling of I don't eat, I don't overeat, I don't abuse food because I have a spiritual hole in my life. And with SMART, there was more of a teaching people how to hold on to the dichotomy of, yes, I was able to stand up to a feeling of, I was able to stand up to wanting to abuse food, and yet, damn it, I still did the next day. It doesn't cancel it out. I'm still a whole person.
Mm-hmm.
And so with SMART, I'm learning how to be, hopefully, a whole person. Like, to see that there are, there are two parts of me, and they are the same. I'm one person that has all these different facets, as the person who I go see, she says. And so it's, I can have feelings, and I won't be murdered by them. They won't kill me. I mean, and that's part of it. It's like I can survive speaking up for myself. I can survive making boundaries. And if someone is upset about it, I can survive that too, because it's all about learning how to take care of my side of the street.
Right.
And not having to worry about everybody else, because that's the position I sit in. And so but that doesn't mean that I'm careless and heartless. It just means that, you, Luke, have to take care of how you're feeling. I have to take care of how I'm feeling, and however we meet in the middle of that.
Yeah.
So that's what I see, about the benefits of SMART. And, and Ted says this all the time about, all of these, not ideas, but these tools can be used for non-addictive behaviors. And so,
but they have a value. They have an intrinsic value for just living life as a human being.
Exactly. What I find, other than the camaraderie, like, I'm a part of a core group of people that we meet every week. I do miss being in person, but also just, it allows, there are times when I'm able to bring in what has happened during the day or the week, and it helps me get perspective as well. And there are times when I call them flashbacks, but something will be happening and I will have a flashback to a SMART recovery meeting or a discussion about tools. And I'm like, oh, okay.
The aha moments. Yeah.
Yeah. so that's what that's what I like about it. And it, it gives me also it gives me another sense of having structure. Like it helps with structure, because I'm horrible at not having structure. It's awful. And so it helps me have structure in my life. For me, learning that it's a journey has been huge. And so in some ways that helps, it helps with taking some of the pressure off, but then it puts more pressure on me. It's, it's crazy. But it's for others, all I can say is for their recovery journey, it's about them. So whatever their recovery journey is, that's what it is for them. Like I've had conversations or talking to other friends where they will say things like, you're going to help me keep on track. And in my head, I'm like, no, I'm not. Because there are times when I can barely keep myself on track. So it's like, I feel uncomfortable with that because, because then there feels like this, it's some sort of pressure to make sure that they do what they're supposed to do. It's like, I can barely do what I'm supposed to do. I can't worry about you too. And so for anyone who's like, I would strongly suggest, if anyone wants to get into recovery, to go to a SMART recovery meeting, because I personally feel it feels more inclusive and it's more welcoming. If they don't, okay. As they always say, in 12-step, take what works for you and leave the rest. Though I think it's a little bit easier said than done in those rooms versus SMART. SMART definitely supports having multiple not arms, but multiple avenues of support.
Yeah, we say pathways to recovery.
Pathways. Thank you. Yeah. I firmly believe that. I mean, like, there are so many things that I have now that I wouldn't have had if I didn't have the different pathways that I've got to help keep me sane and centered.
And with that, I conclude. So thank you all for your attention. And if there's anyone that has any questions about what we just heard, I'm available.